Hello, welcome back. Opening our data science and analytics track this morning, Laura Summers, who is a multidisciplinary designer researching technology ethics and building tools to promote fair machine learning. Laura is passionate about feminism, digital rights, and designing for privacy, which feels like something that should be kind of baseline for anyone practicing machine learning and artificial intelligence, but unfortunately isn't. Laura is the founder of Debias AI and also the human behind open source and community projects like the Ethics Limits Test, FairChive, and the Melbourne Fair Machine Learning Reading Group. Laura can be found on Twitter. Her handle is @SummersScope, and she can also be found on the Venuless platform, where she will be answering your questions during her talk, which has been pre-recorded. She will also be available for questions at the end, so please ask your questions and some of them will be selected for a live answer. So Laura starts with important questions about ethics, but also about practicality, because we all want to be ethical, or at least we all say we do want to be ethical, but how? So drawing on her experience as the ethics ops consultant embedded with a small fraud detection team in a big telco, Laura gives us tips on how to move past the AI ethics hype and how we can start trying, testing, and implementing practical approaches. So please give a virtual hand of applause for our virtual keynote speaker, Laura Summers, and her talk, Fair Game, the Ethics of Telco Fraud.
Okay, let's get started. I've put together a Google Docs document online. You can go to it here at this tiny URL. You can see the links to the slides, extra resources, and also any Q&A you want to pop in there, go for it. So just to quickly point to what I'm going to discuss today, the lineup is we start with deconstruct your proxy. We then go to explicit data design, assuming good faith, and failure first design. And hopefully all those will make sense by the time we get to the end of the talk. So let me set the scene. Starting in early 2020, I was embedded in a small fraud detection team as an ethics ops consultant and as part of a larger telco. It was really a pretty small team. There was one data scientist, one project manager, one ops person who was like communicating with customers and researching stuff with us. We sort of had half a data engineer and a few other devs kind of floating in and out a bit, but mostly that was the team. We were using a combination of internal tools and detection mechanisms and a third-party tool that was doing payment gateway fraud detection. And that was using ML, but none of our internal stuff was like ML. It was all kind of pretty straightforward, deterministic and business logic type stuff. I can't share specifics on the features or the thresholds we were working with, but you'll get an idea through the talk. And we were looking primarily for a kind of fraud called international revenue sharing, which is essentially jacking up the price of a call for an international call by sending it to a mobile or sending it to a premium number where you can charge a higher rate and then sort of taking a margin, taking that higher rate, slicing it off the top and pocketing it as revenue, essentially. So instead of you actually getting a service or talking to someone, they're just making those calls and letting them sit there and accrue minutes and then charging them back to the telco. But we also had other kinds of issues we were dealing with, like service overuse and promotions abuse, where people were sort of pushing the friendship or trying to use like promotions more than they were technically allowed to. So, it was quite a mixed scene. Yeah. And if you don't know what ethics ops is, or if you haven't heard that term before, it's something I've heard around the space. It's I think of it sort of as like DevOps or SecOps, but for ethics, with a view to trying to improve process and give ourselves tools and deployment sort of monitoring approaches that will help us get better at improving the ethics of our system. Another metaphor I like to use is with SREs, like you thinking about this question of how good is your uptime, and you know that you never get to 100%, but you're sort of aiming to get better all the time. Similarly with ethics ops, you don't assume that it's going to be done and you're never going to have 100% perfect ethics, but rather you're trying to observe the state of the world now and get to better. So yeah, fraud is an interesting space in which to discuss ethics. Not only are you, the company, sort of capable of inflicting harm on your customers, you're also under attack by a subset of customers who mean you harm. So you sort of have to balance the real and often urgent costs of identifying bad behavior and sort of mitigating those costs that they're charging to you, while also acknowledging the possibility of false positives and considering how you might identify and support people who get caught in the crossfire. And I think an important way to do that is to develop this gut feeling, this sense check that we mostly, I think, already have, to be honest, which is keeping that healthy cynicism about our data sources. And certainly in the team I was embedded in, like the thing I observed was, it was only when we felt really comfortable and confident in what we thought was going on that something would be really surprising and like kind of turn us on our heads. So yeah, this idea that like we have to always be sensitive to the distance between what it is we can observe and how we draw causality to events in the world or behavior in the world or why people are doing things even is something I think is important to keep in the back of our heads at all times. And a good example of this was we were observing a particular customer who was sending a whole bunch of SMSs overseas. And it was a lot. It was a very high volume. And we were all kind of pretty confident that you couldn't be sending this many SMSs just like manually. So we thought maybe there was some kind of script or bot or automation platform that they were using to broadcast SMSs. And sort of the sort of extension of that was we thought probably they're doing some kind of marketing push. So maybe it's, spam, or maybe they're trying to get visibility somewhere. But we thought it was basically like them trying to use our personal services, essentially a marketing platform. And that really seemed obvious. But then when we called this person up and had a chat with them, we found out that actually they were sitting there with their thumbs messaging just heaps of people. They had a ton of group messages set up, and it was essentially, a communication and talking to people was still like the sort of underlying reason behind their behavior. So that really like flipped everything we thought we knew on its head, and it made us worried that we were going to have difficulty working out what was the malicious behavior from what was just like overuse. And I think one way to think about this is to like take some time and deconstruct your proxy. And that's sort of assuming that you acknowledge that pretty much every data that we might collect is a proxy. It's an approximation for the thing we really want to know, but it's never the actual thing we really want to know. So I'd like to offer a concept framework for this, and we can use the SMS person as an example. So we start with the signal. So in this case, we were observing how many SMSs the service was sending and at what time, and looking at, like the sort of frequency of their sends and that kind of thing. From there, we were then inferring an activity that we thought would be causing the data that we could observe. So on the top, you can see a mobile, and that's sort of someone sitting on their phone typing out SMSs. And on the bottom was what we thought it was, which was some kind of bot or script. And from there, we can then make another logic leap, which is inferring some kind of persona or motive behind the activity that we think is causing the signal that we're observing. So you can see here how I'm constructing this. Like, it's kind of forcing us to acknowledge that we're taking one or two or more leaps of logic in getting from what it is we can see to what it is we think is happening in the world. And that helps us keep a really healthy humility and nuance in understanding what it is we can observe, and not getting too confident in saying like this equals this and there's no other interpretation. So when we look at persona, like again, we went down the bad route and we thought, oh, they're sending spam or SMS or something. But in fact, it was just a really large number of people talking on group chats and like communicating and sharing information. And you can think of other ways that people might generate that kind of data as well. For instance, you could be a developer testing out a Twilio API, and that's also not a malicious use of your phone, but it might be unexpected. So the next thing I want to talk about is this idea that once we really get into our heads that we don't know everything perfectly and that we have to like allow for uncertainty, we also have to try and give ourselves the biggest leg up we can to interpreting and handling information we do think we know, especially under stress. So I want to make a distinction here between what you might think of as explanatory data science, where you're trying to describe the world, you're trying to understand what's happening. You may not be sure what the right answer is, and you're sort of going at it from different lenses or cutting the data in different ways. And that's a really important and useful thing to do, but that's not really what I'm talking to right now. So what I mean when I talk about load-bearing design or, data science under pressure is when you have an alert set up and, that alert triggers some activity, or it means that you have to go check out a service, or you have to go have a look at a customer and see if something unexpected is happening. And it usually means that you have to respond in the moment, whether it's 8 in the morning or 2 in the morning. So yeah, I'm really talking specifically to load bearing and high pressure situations for the rest of this section. And with that in mind, I think it's really important to emphasize that data and misinterpretation is not just easy, but likely under pressure. We're putting our data science outputs through a ringer or into a crucible and really seeing how well they stand up. So if we want them to survive that environment, we have to design for cognitive load. That means not putting too much information in the view, and that means being really cautious to make everything as interpretable and explicit as possible. And I think it's important to remember that simple design doesn't imply that you are stupid, the person receiving that design, or maybe even your friend or your colleague or the junior or your project manager. It just means that you're recognizing how important it is for this to go right. And another anecdote from my time in fraud detection was that we had these alerts coming through to Slack, and the alerts were coming from data that would be ingested, then a batch would run and a feature would get calculated, and then depending on the outcome of that, there was another delay, and then they would come into Slack. So there's sort of a time frame between when the data would be ingested and when we would get this alert. And whenever the alert was bad and we were worried about things, we would go check our logs and have this momentary panic, because we would forget about the delay between when the data was ingested and when this alert was coming out. And we would be like, oh shit, oh, the log is showing something different to the alert. Oh no, so we'd think not only that something was going wrong, as in we were under a fraud attack, but also that our systems had fallen down in some way, and kind of doubly panic. So I really wish I could go back in time and tell Laura from the past to take the time to make that as explicit as possible. So what are other pointers for making your data as interpretable as possible? This is probably an obvious one, but it bears repeating. Avoid DSL, avoid domain-specific language, avoid TLAs, the 3-letter acronyms, and particularly don't put more than one of them in a line or in a sentence, right? The more that you have, the more opportunity for people to get confused. So an example here of this going wrong on the left is where we see USNs breach tier 1. What's a USN? On the right, you can see that it's actually unique service numbers. That makes that a bit more clear. Another, again, probably obvious one, but one that people easily miss is add units. We can see on the left, I've got a tier 1 is a breach of over 30 something in 24 hours. But what does that mean? It could be SMSs, it could be hours on call, it could be number of calls made in total. On the right, we can see it says 30 calls in 24 hours. So now I know what it is we're talking about. This is a bit of a bugbear of mine. If you are talking about things like delta or percentiles and you're looking at change up or down, say over a rolling 24-hour period or over a week, that's a perfectly valid way of looking for spikes in behavior or changes, but it's really important to ground that with your absolute or total count of the thing. So for example, here on the left, we see 12% and 24% increases in tier 1 and tier 2. That seems like tier 2 is really a problem, but then if you ground that in, well, it's only 3 unique service numbers for the top tier, and then 2 unique service numbers for the middle tier, they're about the same. They don't actually have that much difference. It's just because the volume of the initial breaches was quite different. So yes, that kind of getting sucked into percentiles without knowing how many in total we're thinking about really matters for deciding what needs action, for instance. And then again, to the anecdote I was sharing at the beginning of this section, if your data currency is different to the time you see the alert or see the dashboard or whatever it is you're looking at, make that as clear as possible. And, don't assume that people will remember, because you're just adding more stress into their heads at a period when they're already under stress. I think it's important to remember when we work with fraud, but also when we think about, fairness and ethics, it's easy to kind of get into this mindset of being a bit spy versus spy and seeing like kind of bad actors and malfeasance everywhere. And I think not that we don't want to be able to imagine what can go wrong, but I think it's important that we start from the assumption of good faith, particularly for our comms, and then work our way down from there. So we don't want to start at like, a 10 for suspicion. We want to start at a 1 and like kind of add points of evidence. And then, if someone's really acting in bad faith, then we can up the ante on the tone. And especially remembering that there's no need to suspect bad intentions when laziness or incompetence explains the same thing just as well. So I think it's important to avoid falling into that trap of being ultra suspicious and seeing bad stuff everywhere. And I think a good way to avoid that trap is to be explicitly, deliberately kind and respectful in all of our communications. And when I say communications, I mean not only how we talk to customers, whether it's actually a communication like a phone call or an email, or whether it's an email template or a notification template that we're setting up, or if it's how we talk about them inside our teams about a customer or an end user. Like the more we can set this intention and stick to it, I think the safer we are. And you might be saying to me, well, Laura, what if it's a bad actor? And to be totally blunt, my answer is so what? I don't think it matters if you speak respectfully to a bad actor, but I do think you can cause a lot of harm if you come at, a confused actor or actor who's just like doesn't understand what they're doing that's wrong with like a lot of aggression or a lot of suspicion or sort of interrogative tone. So if you can bring it all back and start from the assumption that they may just not know that they're not allowed to do the thing or that it's not appropriate, and try and give them as much sort of principled support as you can, and then work from there, you're much less likely to cause brand damage. You're much less likely to lose customers because you've alienated them. And I think if you simply take it down to the bottom line, you're much less likely to lose money. And on top of that, if you do talk to a bad actor in good faith, you sometimes catch them out, right? Like they kind of think, oh, they don't suspect me. And as a result, they'll tell you things that confirm your suspicions about them. So there's this like additional value in coming at them with real like, clean, neutral, respectful language. And to add to all of that, we're in the middle of a pandemic. People are having a bad time. You don't know their circumstances. You don't know how much money they're earning or not earning, and you don't know certainly what's driving them to do what they're doing. So I think it's important to remember also that we don't want to be moralizing about this or judgmental. So it's better to try and keep that aspect of it out of it and just focus on what it is you need to do. So if it's preventing behaviors, if it's nudging people along the right path, like keep those as your guiding star and get away from this issue of I was right and they were wrong, or I was better than them. Another tip for trying to get this better is to focus on describing behaviors and not people, or activity that you can observe and not people. So for example, in the fraud team, we were calling people fraudsters and abusers a lot. And it was something that kind of didn't sit right in my gut. And I was sort of interrogating, why do I not like this use of language? And it was like, we're doing the thing of making the assumption and saying that's definitely what's happening, but also it's got this kind of judgmental tone. And we're adding a bunch of like probably unnecessary judgmental and moralizing attitude to something that can be quite simple. So we just started talking instead about, I can observe like this person sending a lot of SMSs to country X, or they've had a spike in phone call behavior. And when you start doing that, it again, like it focuses you on what you actually know and doesn't take you past that into like the assumptions that you make from that or the inferences that you make from that. Don't mistake this whole rant for saying that I don't think you should intervene on people who are behaving inappropriately in your systems. I absolutely do think that that's important. And in fact, often I think we can solve these problems better upstream in product by like designing in clearer like boundaries for what's acceptable, or making the product offer more clear, or otherwise adding in those guardrails. But I'm just saying you can do that work and still stay respectful in your communication style. So the last finding I want to talk to is this thing I like to call failure first design. And that, stated simply, is saying that we start from the assumption that the system will sometimes fail, and then we plan for it. This quote I love from Stuart Russell, and he says, "Assuming perfect knowledge of the objective decouples the machine from the human. What the human does no longer matters because the machine knows the goal and pursues it." And I think that's a really important way of like helping us think about this. Like, we don't even know our own objectives perfectly, let alone people's objectives. We often do a really poor job of capturing preferences, for instance. And we live in a world where there's no bug-free software. And when you add in stochastic noise and non-deterministic systems, you have all of these abstraction layers and aspects of our tech that can go wrong. So just accepting that that's the world we're living in and trying to say, well, we'll inject some humility into our planning and into our design, and we'll try and continue to do these little micro adjustments based on what people tell us about their preferences, their experiences, etc. The more likely we are to not get down the path of having done something horrifically bad to a lot of people and not even known about it until something terrible happens. So I think about this work as like designing an escape hatch or adding lifeboats to a big ship, right? Like, it's not necessarily something that we like to think about. It's not necessarily fun work. And in fact, you may think that success looks like never seeing it get used. But you still have to make sure it's there and it's functioning. And if people do need to use it, you want to make sure that it's actually usable. So feedback loops, in order to discover things about people's experience in the moment, need to be intuitive, contextual, and timely. And what I mean by that is we really can't just throw some support channel at the bottom of our page and assume that people will talk to us, right? We have to actually ask them questions about the specific contextual thing they're doing in our tool at the moment. So some little examples of that. We might, for instance, on the left, we're looking at Spotify, which is a music streaming service, and it's showing me like the different genres that I listen to the most. Now, I might know that I listen to a lot of lo-fi hip hop, but actually prefer to listen to a bit more classical. So I've got a link which lets me adjust my preferences. On the right, a little bit more of a dire example. I've applied for a loan of $85,000 and been rejected. And what I've done is added a couple of buttons that give me ways to kind of further explore that explanation I've seen, and maybe like let me talk to someone, or let me kind of break down how that algorithmic decision worked so that I can actually understand if I agree with it and see if I need to take more action or not. Another big one with image classification is just letting people tell you when you're wrong, especially if it's their images. In this example, we can see it's incorrectly classified as a cute puppy, as a cute kitten. Another one that I like to talk about a lot is adding in the level of confidence of your system. Just kind of letting people know that you don't think you're perfect is much more encouraging for gathering feedback as well. This is a pattern you've probably seen a lot. It's getting a lot more popular now, where we see spikes of activity or things changing on your account, unexpected logins and new machines. And we'll sort of send someone a message immediately in the moment and just check and see it was them. And most of the time it is, but when it's not, it lets us sort of smell out suspicious activity very quickly. And the last one, which I think is pretty easy to do and important but easy to forget, is if you're working in a domain where you're expecting someone to experience harm, or you're worried that that's a likely outcome for them, you can just ask. You can ask them, in the moment that they're doing the thing, like filling out the form or using your tool, or you can ask them like as a screening question before they join. But asking these questions of if they've experienced harm before or if they're experiencing harm currently in your tool can be a surprisingly fruitful way of eliciting what it is that's happening. So it's really important that if we do these things, we don't just want them to fall in a heap, right? So we do have to plan and do a bit more work. And that can look like customer support or writing a support script or thinking through policies for the use of your tool. It also means you have to be really meticulous about capturing your learnings. You don't want them to just sit in a bunch of support tickets. You need to have some kind of data schema. It can just be a spreadsheet somewhere, but you still want to make sure you know what it is someone did and what you classified them as, and if something changed, how that classification changed. And importantly, if you do find out that your model isn't great or if something's going wrong in your logic, that you can leave time for product or model improvements. And also preparing for pushback. This is a little bit of a sad story part of the talk, but people don't like it when you make bad assumptions about them, and that's okay. You just have to prepare yourself mentally for that experience. If you think to yourself, oh, well, I'm making something visible that previously wasn't visible, and that means that some people are going to say, oh yeah, that makes sense to me and I agree with it. And some people are going to be like, oh, okay, I don't like that anymore, or I think this company doesn't know what they're doing. You're inviting the opportunity for people to disagree with you or to think that you are doing something a little bit different than they originally expected. But that said, you're still going to find out much sooner if something is going wrong than you do if you just have no feedback loops baked in the first place. And certainly in my experience in fraud, we had a few instances with these kinds of feedback loops where we had some very angry customers and some very clear mismatches of their mental model of what they thought they were buying and what we were telling them they had bought. And it was uncomfortable, but it was also really important for us to know. So just to review, we've talked to deconstructing your proxy, explicit data design, assuming good faith, and failure first design. And hopefully those are useful little flag posts for you to remember and think about how to do this work a little bit better. And just to close up with a metaphor, I think of making tech as us working together, sitting on a big ship, a cruise liner. And when you go below decks, it's quiet and safe. It's maybe even boring, you don't even have a sense that you're going anywhere. But when you come back out on deck, you have a sense of the speed and the mass of water displaced. And I think as technologists and as people working, with data systems, with real humans in the world, we don't want to insulate ourselves from that sensation. We want to feel the wind rushing through our hair. We want to have a little frisson of fear and not be too comfortable. Because I do think the real game is trying to catch fraud, yet not defraud ourselves. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed that. I just want to add one little note, which is I am working on a tool which is coming soon, which is called Sweet Summer Child Score. It's going to be a test which scans for harm to people and communities by data-driven systems. That's going to be free and open source. And I'm looking for testers to help me kick the tires. So please do reach out to me at laura@dbias.ai if you think you could help. Thanks again.
Welcome back. Thank you, Laura. That has been an amazing talk. And, as someone who already knew the outline and had learned something from it, I've learned so much from every one of your slides. There are questions. The first one is, what have you found helpful for getting people who might be, might have some resistance, some friction to changing the ways they operate? They have operated traditionally, like traditional fraud teams at, this kind of institutions.
Yeah, look, it's a great question. It's one I ran into a lot in this experience. The short answer is it's hard and you can't fix it straight away. The longer answer is trying to come up with champions, people who genuinely care about the work and being really visible about, awarding them, applauding them, recognizing their work when they do. They do kind of model these behaviors of holding themselves back from being too judgmental or sort of focusing on behaviors and outcomes and not focusing on, moralizing or judging people. It can be a long slog because you're really changing mental models and you're changing these very ingrained behaviors. So also being patient with yourself that it's not going to happen overnight. I think